panel. Before we kick off, I do want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land that we all meet on today. I want to pay my respects to the elders past and present. So today is a really important day. It's the 4th flexible working day. Who knows if we'll be here next year? I have no idea. We've seen such a paradigm shift in how we think about flexibility. And so today we're having a conversation about the gender flex gap. And what I want to share up front is that we do recognise that gender is not binary, but for the purposes of this conversation, we're focusing on the way gender presents in a majority of relationships that are impacted by the gender flex gap. So today I'm joined by an absolutely fabulous panel that will incredibly patient and resilient human beings, as you can see here. They all possess a really high level of what I call leader flex. So the ability to lead themselves flexibly and others, and we'll hear more about that in a minute. So firstly, we've got the wonderful Lisa Annese, the CEO at Diversity Council of Australia, Mark Morris, and I've said here Director of Corporate Services, that's not right, Director of Ministerial Services for Premiers in Cabinet in Queensland, Faye Calderone, a partner at Hall & Wilcox, and Ben Tifan, a Director at the Department of Defence. So today is going to be a very interactive panel discussion. I think you're going to really enjoy it. So if you've got a spare device, grab it, because what we'll be doing is some live polling through today's session. And I'm going to try and get everybody's camera on so we can see their gorgeous faces as we go. So I'll explain to you how this works. So if you grab your device and you jump on menti.com, and basically you type in the code 129403. We'd love to hear from you around what hat are you wearing today? Have you come to this presentation as a leader, a manager, a HR professional, diversity inclusive falls in there obviously as well, employee, self-employed or other? So what you do is go to menti.com, you type in that code, and we'd love to hear and see who we've got in this fabulous audience today. All right, so you can see down the bottom, we've got 9 responses. So how Menti works is it keeps a count. So the little head on the bottom right says we've had 10 responses, 12 responses. And recognising not everyone will be using Menti today. So what I do is I just keep an eye on it until it keeps cropping up, and then when it starts to slow down, what we'll do is we'll move on. And we'll be using this quite a bit today, which I've no doubt you're going to find quite fun. So we've got a lot of HR professionals. Next is employees, leaders, employees and self-employed, which is fabulous. Thank you for sharing. That gives us a bit of context on and helps us bespoke our responses to you today. All right. Next, I'd love you to grab your device again and type in the code 129406. If you didn't shut the page, you can just press go to slide. We want to hear from you what comes to mind when you hear the term the gender flex gap. Okay, now what I'm going to ask, I am going to ask you, Faye, first, if that's okay, because your camera's on while I try and work out how to turn everyone else's cameras on. I'd love your reflections first. Firstly, share a little bit about us and what the last few months have meant for you working flexibly. And then I'd love you to share any reflections on looking at this fabulous word cloud of what people have shared around the gender flex gap.
Sure, thanks Vanessa. I'm a partner at Hall & Wilcox in the Employment and Workplace Relations team, and I've been a flexible work ambassador with Vanessa for the last couple of years, now since 2018, so this is our 3rd flexible work day together, and that coincided with the launch of the firm's Agile program, which basically mainstreamed flexible work for everyone, and that really was based on, you know, an observation or an understanding that there was systemic structural issues and inequalities that led to the gender pay gap and were barriers to the progression of women in the law and into leadership roles. And basically what's in this gender flex gap heat map that you've got here are all the things that form the foundation or the prejudices against flexible work that meant that there was designated mummy briefs, or there was a designated mummy track of often that was associated with the take-up of flexible work, which meant that we didn't have people that were accessing it weren't really progressing in the way that they should, and that we weren't making the use of their talents. Words like inequity, bias, stigma is a huge one. And, you know, the thing that we're working towards mostly in mainstreaming flexible work is removing the stigma attached for men taking up flexible work as well, because we know that they are more likely to be discriminated against and also more likely to have their flexible work requests denied. But so long as men are not taking up flexible work, then women are trying to do it all while have it all while do it all, and that means that they'll be at a disadvantage.
Wonderful. All right, I'm still not having any luck with the video, so if anyone can help, drop in the chat how we can turn on these videos. But what I'd love next, Ben, are you able to share? I know your video's not on, it's not ideal, I'm working on it. Are you able to share who you are, what your experience has been over the last few months, and any reflections also that you've got on this word cloud?
Yeah, certainly. We'll get to the video, I'm sure.
Yeah,
that's not too much of a problem. Look, I've been working on people strategies within defence, attempting to embed a flexible work culture in a very large organisation that has a lot of support from leadership to do so, but it's hard. There are bias, which is coming up as the big word in the cloud at the moment, and a lot of it is cultural. So over the last few months with the coronavirus and isolation kicking in, there was almost enforced flexibility, I suppose, in a way. So people started working remotely. For me, that meant being at home with 3 young children and having to school my children during the day and working from about 10:30 at night till 3 in the morning most days, because that was when I had the time to do my job outside of looking after kids, spending time with my family that wasn't screaming at the kids to do their schoolwork, which was really hard. I suppose the biggest reflection I've got on flexible work is around the culture side of things. So the 2 things you need, in my opinion, for flexible work to be as productive and as effective as possible is technology and culture. And that's, the technology to actually work remotely or flexibly or from different locations or rapidly and in an agile way. But it's the culture of leadership that I think is the most important part. So if you don't have that technology, you can get by if you've got a culture that promotes and supports and understands what flexible work is. But if you don't have that culture, it doesn't matter how good your technology is, you'll run into all the problems that this word cloud is showing us now. And that's around bias, inequity, inequality. Bias, I think, is the big one, because it's not even necessarily gender bias that plays in, but it's personal bias from a leader who doesn't know enough about flexible work or isn't comfortable with it that can be the biggest impediment. I'll pass back to you now, Vanessa.
Absolutely. And thank you for your vulnerability in sharing your story. I know sometimes it's really hard for us to say what this has meant, and you sharing that you're working through the night to get stuff done. Like, that's just a brutal reality. And I think many of us, I was shaking my head, and I'm sure many others would be saying, yeah, look, we did what we had to do to get there. So Lisa, I do apologise. I'm working on the camera in the background. I've got the team looking at it, but yeah, I'm close, I feel, like you said, Ben.
Well, we hope that you'll get there. Look, thanks for having me. The way I reflect on this topic is that DCA has known for a decade that flexible working can be really good for business and can be really good for individuals. Sorry, I'm just answering a start my video request. We know that it can work, but it's not an art, it's actually a science. And just plonking yourself in a different location and turning the Zoom camera on isn't going to necessarily, I mean, you'll still get some work done, but as you know, as we know, all kinds of flexible working, you know, lives or dies with the capability of the leaders, the supervisors, the managers, and their ability to create a cohesive team, an organisation's ability to ensure that human connection is maintained despite, in this case, working remotely. And we do know that flexible work isn't just about working remotely, that has to be said. I mean, we're thinking about it in that context at the moment. But flexible work is about where you work, but also how you work and when you work. And so it's really important to understand that we need to focus on the capability of managers and supervisors and organisations to ensure that we set people up for success when they're working in a flexible way, and hopefully not go back to the redundant way of not feeling as though it was even an option to work flexibly. In terms of this word cloud, it's really interesting. There is a gender difference between how men and women in heteronormative relationships access flexible work. Up until very recently, this was the domain of women for various reasons. Some have been already pointed out by Faye. It's true, men don't have their flexible working requests approved at quite the same rate. Indeed, many are very reluctant to ask for it because of a concept we understand to be the gender bind, where they're punished by within their own gender and outside it also for behaving in a way that's not stereotypically masculine and being maybe a primary carer. But also what we know is that without men's participating flexibly, especially in situations where flexibility is used to support caring responsibilities, it really limits women's opportunity to fully contribute in the workplace. And it also leads to overly exhausted women. I mean, the situation that we've just heard, I think Ben relay about having to work through the night and work and then so that he can sort of be a primary carer during the day. This has been the lot of many women for time immemorial, that in order to maintain a steady ability to engage productively in the workplace, they have also had to absorb most of the primary caring outside the workplace. In DCA's research that we put out last year on the economics of the gender pay gap, where we looked at caring as a component of the pay gap, we were able to determine that even when men and women work the same number of hours, pre-pandemic, women were still doing the majority of the housekeeping and the child rearing and caring for elder relatives, which basically means that trying to participate more fully in the workplace without having any equitable distribution of caring responsibilities means that it provides women with no, of course women opt out of potential careers. They have no choice. It's a choice, it's not a choice. A real choice, a genuine choice, is when women do have the ability to scale up into careers and and they make an absolute decision with the support of, you know, the community or their families in terms of their obligations around caring. So my hope moving forward is that we seize this opportunity not only to support those men who do want to increase their level of engagement at home and their caring, because we know it's good for them and it's good for their families, and that we don't go back to a time where we had such serious division between men and women around how labour is distributed at home and at work. And the other thing, just to end on, is this pandemic has created high visibility for caring and for female-dominated professions, nursing, teaching, people who work in supermarkets, for example, and high visibility around what it actually takes to run a family and still engage in the workplace. And I hope we don't lose that empathy and that organisations find a new way forward. And I'll finish on that because I could talk, as you can imagine, at length on this.
Really, yeah, beautiful how you shared that. And I hope that it is a fundamental positive change around how, as a society, we value caring. Because as we know, it hasn't been valued.
Not at all. And it's one of the most, it holds a society together. As the pandemic took hold, what were people fretting over, apart from internet connection and making sure they had a desk at home? It was homeschooling, it was lack of childcare, it was nursing, it was all of those fundamental things that women have done the lion's share of since societies were invented.
Yeah, a wonderful segue into our next panelist. So Mark, if you don't mind introducing ourselves and also sharing any reflections that you have on this word cloud.
Yeah, sure. Look, thanks, Vanessa. It's a hard act to follow with everyone, but look, yeah. So just to start with, thanks for highlighting, Vanessa, that my actual role title is Director of Ministerial Services, the Department of Premier and Cabinet, Queensland. I intentionally kind of advertise myself as a Director of Corporate Services because that's probably easier to understand for people that don't actually work within, you know, the cabinet type circles. But yeah, so I am a dad to a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old, Lucy and Harvey, husband to wife Alana, you know, white male, 38 years old. So, you know, pretty average and not probably the most expected advocate of, you know, equity and D&I statistically, which is sad, I think. And I think these types of forums, you know, and I've been a champion of D&I and flexible working for a long time, really attract a large cohort of women and a large cohort of HR professionals. And it's really the rest of the business and the rest of, you know, the community that we as the champions need to carry the load and take them on the journey with us, because they're not here, they're not listening, they're not a part of the conversations, and that's part of the problem. So, you know, I could rabbit on all day as well, but I'll try to keep brief. So my experience with Flex is, you know, long-standing, and, you know, I'm through the lens of a public sector state government employee, and that changes things, obviously. And just picking up on a few other things that the people have said, but then elaborating, I suppose, is, you know, I am passionate about this, not only because it's the right thing to do, but because I'm also passionate about business return and business performance, and looking after our people and doing the right thing by people ultimately leads to, you know, better business performance and better business outcomes. So it's, the business case stacks up, you know, pretty easily from my perspective. I have a varied, you know, experience with different types of flexible, noting that flex means all sorts of different things. Yes, we're here to talk about the gender flex gap, and I think the gender flex gap exists not only for parents, even though obviously a lot of it is about parenting and caregiving, and, you know, statistically speaking, you know, you're talking about heterogeneous relationships, but I know a lot of my friends are in the LGBTIQ community, and I know some of those, you know, same-sex couples who don't have children, who are prejudiced against because of assumptions and biases towards either men or women, because, you know, largely because of expectations around caregiving, you know, obligations and priorities. And I've been on panels where the discussion has been, oh, well, this woman is, you in her 30s, and we're not going to give it to her because chances are she's going to have kids soon, or she's going to be less focused than a male, you know what I mean? But then on the other side of it as well, I've got, friends that are male in relationships, and they're prejudiced against because the expectations on them is that because they don't have kids, that they'll work longer and harder than people that do. So there's all sorts of biases and broken expectations that we need to try and fix. I think we need to talk about leadership role design, because, you know, a lot of leadership roles, the expectation is that you're, you know, working 50, 60 hours a week, at least in some instances. And so, you know, what that means is that you've got a cohort of people, say statistically 30 to 40, you know, it's probably growing a little bit, where you've got young kids, where managing a leadership role and managing young kids is really difficult. So if we're continuing to design leadership roles to require them to work 50 to 60 hours a week, what we're actually saying is we're going to discount 30 to 40-year-olds, basically. Like, you can't have young kids and do a leadership role, because the balance between the two just doesn't stack up. And, you know, I used to be, you know, young and naive and ignorant, you know, pre having kids. And I used to see the people leaving work at, you know, 4 and 5, and I've got to do pickup. And I was like, oh, bloody hell, I've got to keep working because they've got to go and do pickup. And I tell you what, though, like, empathy sometimes only comes through experience. And since being a dad, like, I had no idea what fatigue was. You know what I mean? There is no greater challenge than trying to perform on 1 to 2 hours sleep on an ongoing basis. Not only that, but the emotional strain. So, you know, I think, you know, as someone said, you know, the brother and sisterhood of parenting really binds people together in some sort of shared pain that we're all going through on a daily basis. But, you know, this recent experience of COVID has really shone a light on you know, the ability to work remotely for a lot of us in corporate roles. And I think, you know, we've got to break down experiences as well, because we've got pre-COVID, then we've got COVID. Now we're in this period where we're kind of like transitioning back, and then we're setting ourselves up for whatever the future holds. And I think each of them carry different kind of biases around, you know, flex. So yeah, look, as I said, I could talk all day. I'll probably finish on one little story that I used with you recently, Vanessa, as well, is that, you know, it was not long after my daughter was born. So she was about 6 months old, and I was, I won't mention the organisation, but I was working for an organisation, and, you know, the expectations of the role were pretty high. And I was having a conversation with a fairly senior person saying, you know, look, I really want to be able to leave the office at a reasonable time each day to get home to support my wife and spend time with my daughter, and then I can happy to get back on the tools later that night. And the punchline of the conversation was, you know, from his perspective, I think your wife needs to be more supportive of your career. And I was just like gobsmacked, and a part of me, I thought, are we having this conversation? Is this real? Am I being punked? So, you know, I just couldn't believe that actually happened in, you know, today. You know, that was only a few years ago. So it happens, it's out there, it's probably still happening, but, you know, we have to fight against it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your personal stories as well. So it's back over to you. So we want to hear from you. How does flexible work impact your life? So in this moment, how's flexible work impacting your life? It might be benefits, it might be other ways that it's impacting your life. So we'll give you a couple of moments to share. I'm seeing some questions rolling in, which is fabulous. So we are going to hold them to the end. And what you can do is enter your questions on the tab below, or if you would rather, you can enter them in Menti. So there will be a page. So if you go to menti.com, type in the code 129406, you have the opportunity to share some questions. All right, so what we're going to do is, Lisa, would you mind going first? I'd love to hear a little bit from your perspective around how flexibility has impacted your life of lately, and any reflections that you're taking away on the comments that are being shared here. So they'll automatically just scroll as we go.
Yeah, look, the organisation I lead, we've always been really flexible. It hasn't been a challenge at all for us to pivot to flexible working, because we've always done it. Every person at DCA has always worked at least half of their days remotely. And even within the, you know, we've always just had core office time, and we've only had that to build team connection and for shared activities. So we've actually always done it. So there's been zero adjustment. I mean, the main impact for me from the COVID pandemic has been I've been working at home, and I don't normally do that, not because I won't allow myself to, but just my role demands that I'm always traveling and I'm out and about. So in terms of how that's impacted me working from home, it's been great. I've been getting up later and I'm not commuting and I'm not traveling. So it's given me an enormous amount of additional time. My kids are older. My youngest is in year 11 in New South Wales High School, and my oldest is, almost finished university. So I've gone through what it's like to have really young kids and working. And believe you me, when I did it, if you think it's still a challenge now, when I was doing it, it was entirely weighted on my shoulders to have a career and do all of the childcare. And certainly even in those days, I didn't have access to flexibility, especially when I was a very young mum. So I'm just loving the extra time and the less frazzled start and finish to the day. I'm also loving the fact that everything, that everything we've always said to be true about flexible work is now being realised by other organisations, and it's been really a pleasure to help them improve how they work flexibly. But for me, it's been great. I'm now going into the city only one day a week, and there's no one there, so it's not hard to socially distance. But that's also nice, just to have that, change of scenery. But I've really enjoyed the remote working, because I actually have not done it, but that's because of the nature of my job.
Isn't that fabulous? And a lot of the comments here are similar to what you've said, Lisa, around it's been game changing. I've had so much more time. I haven't been commuting, less travel. All these amazing benefits to our well-being.
Yeah, and I mean, it has to be said that I have a safe home.
Of course, and this needs to be said.
And that's not true for everyone. I mean, people who are in situations of domestic and family violence, the most dangerous place for them is their home. And that's the reason why so many organisations have kept their offices opened, because for some people, working at home is a life-threatening thing for them. And certainly there's been an increase in domestic violence and family violence related incidents during the pandemic. So that has to be said. The other thing that has to be said is I have a good setup at home. I have all the ergonomic setup required, and I'm in an area that has the broadband, so I've got reliable internet as well. So I mean, all of those things, the bare bones need to be in place for remote working to be successful, for you to even start being able to engage in a successful way.
Yeah, no, well said. Thank you for bringing that up, Lisa. It's such an important point. And if you're not consciously supporting and very proactively supporting your people around that, then that is something that you need to be putting on your agenda. Today is a good day to be putting this on your agenda about how do you support some of your most vulnerable people. So over to you, Ben. I'd love to hear. You've touched a little bit on how flexible work has impacted your life over the coming months. What are your reflections on this word cloud, or the comments rather that are scrolling on the screen?
Yeah, look, the one that's actually stood out to me the most as I'm reading through these is someone's put down there saying, I will never accept a job that doesn't allow me to work flexibly ever again after experiencing it. And I have to say, I've changed roles in the last 2 weeks inside Defence. And that was the first conversation I had with my new supervisor. It was about maintaining the flexibility that I currently have. And that wasn't the coronavirus working remotely flexibility. I drop my kids to school in the morning and I start work at 9:30 on most days. I also leave by about 4:35, so I'm at home to help my wife with dinner or to prepare dinner and to actually spend some time with my kids, help them do their reading and their homework before they go to bed. So for me, that's the most important part of flexible work, is the work-life balance and being able to spend the time with my family that I want to spend with them. And I have to agree with that 100%. I would no longer accept a position that didn't allow me that flexibility. Now, obviously it goes both ways. There are some times in the last 2 weeks, I've gotten home at 6:30 a few times because I'm learning a new job, some things have been on, and you have to be flexible in all ways So it's not just about the flexibility that you receive, but you have to be flexible too. So, but in general, the impacts on my life are amazing. I'm now actually actively working one day remotely from home since the coronavirus. Now, I hadn't done that beforehand, much like Lisa, simply because my job wasn't set up that way. Most of my job is meetings, talking with people, leading a team of people, so being available. But what coronavirus demonstrated is you can still do all of that remotely, especially if you've got connection in the office on other days. There's nothing that you can't discuss with someone over the phone or over a video conference. There are some conversations that are harder to have and some things that are harder to coordinate, but as long as you're in the office some days, it doesn't make much of a difference at all. I think I saw a productivity increase across my team during coronavirus. And it had a lot to do with some of the other comments that are coming up around a shorter commute, being able to work at the times I'm productive. I personally have always managed to outcomes rather than time. So I'm more interested in people delivering their work than how many hours they sit at a desk looking at a screen. And I think presenteeism is one of the biggest problems in most public sector organisations.
Thanks, Ben. Your internet's a bit unstable at the moment.
People are just turning up for the hours, but not actually work, has a very large impact on that because.
Okay, Ben's frozen. I don't think he knows he's frozen. Ben, are you there?
They might jam all of their work into. Oh, sorry.
Your internet was quite unstable. You froze for a second.
Nope. Am I back?
You're back.
Nope.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. So, yeah, look, I think in general, what this has shown is that flexible work is a benefit in many, many ways. But some of the things that people have mentioned in the word scroll as well, is that some people have found themselves working longer hours and doing more work during coronavirus because they were working remotely. And again, I think it's a leadership thing and a conversation that needs to be had about how to actually manage flexible and remote work so that you don't do those things, because that's not what it's supposed to be about. It is supposed to be about what works for. And I had many conversations with my team over the coronavirus period, and we were having them regularly, twice a week, talking about how people were and how they were coping. And regardless of the amount of communication I put out about expectations and wanting people to be safe and well, each week something new would come up where someone, was worried about how much time they'd taken to have a coffee break, or someone had, they'd been stressed out and they went for a run during their lunch break, but it took them an hour and a half and they were worried it had been too long. And my response to that was, I don't even need you to log that as time off if you don't want to. If you're going for a run in the middle of the day during this and it's helping you, that's great. Your well-being is more important than the work you're producing right now. And I think that's a message that gets lost a lot of the time. I'll pass back now.
Great, thank you, Ben. Over to you, Faye. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you're seeing come up in this word cloud and what your last couple of months have been like.
I know a lot of these words are actually, a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, Vanessa, words like trust, and trust is so fundamental, and I think it has been an opportunity for employers to let go of the fears that they had about flexible working and to really trust their people, and it's been positively received in many ways because they have been delivering. I have had reports, for employers and businesses have been, reporting increased productivity, increased efficiency. That being said, although this is a forced trial run for flexible working, this is not the new normal that we've been talking about for the last few years. This is a very strange predicament that we've found ourselves in, where the entire workforce has been, forced to go remote, virtually overnight. It's not, there have been circumstances where there wasn't the infrastructure available. Like Lisa said, we've got safety concerns for some people. There's, clearly there's the predicament where we've gone to managing an entirely remote workforce in circumstances where leaders haven't got you know, the vital skills that are necessary to do that, or the appreciation for the science that it really is, which is, you know, to manage flexibility by design and to look at outcomes. And, you know, those practices are difficult to adopt and embrace overnight for managers that have been so used to presenteeism and quite traditional and autocratic structures. That being said, if we can make it through this period and we can, you know, have productivity increases or demonstrate, you know, the benefits during this period, I think it's time to iron out the glitches and cherry pick and take the best of it, because we know that the new normal, which is when we've gone back to work and people are, you know, working flexibly, perhaps partly in the office, but perhaps, you know, partly at home, that's when I think we're going to really see, basically harness the benefits that this will bring. Personally, for me, my boys are almost 9 and 14 in the next couple of months, and today marks exactly 3 months of being at home. It was 10th of March, I remember distinctly. That you know, was my first day, and I pretty much didn't leave the area for the best part of that, save as to Mother's Day. It's been extraordinary. I had when I've had my firstborn, I had 5 months off work, actually 5 months off work for both of them. But at that time it was ADSL dial-up, so flexible work wasn't a thing. Well, it was a thing, we tried it, but it was a very clunky, difficult thing, and I was the only one that was accessing it. And that is, you know, sort of the very opposite of what we're trying to achieve by mainstreaming and, you know, flexibility by design. So at that time, I just felt like I was in no man's land. I was 50 k's from the city where my workplace was, and I was, you know, not part of the mummy group that started the day I went back to work, mind you, and not part of the workplace because they just couldn't trickle the work to me or didn't know how to, you know, sort of do that quickly enough. Fast forward to almost 9 years ago when my second born was born, we had, you know, portable devices, and obviously we got a bit better. But again, I only had 5 months. I was partner by that stage and sort of, you know, came back to work. So other than 3 weeks off, I realised just the other week actually, other than maybe leave of, you know, 3 to maximum of 4 weeks off in that entire time, I've never seen my boys for this much consecutively. So the fact that we're at 3 months, that's triple the amount of time I've seen them since they were born. And that, it's quite a, you know, from a personal point of view, that was quite a, you know, vulnerable and a bit scary moment for me that, you know, I had spent so much time away from them and didn't know what it would be like to spend 3 months, you know, sort of in the same house together. All the same, I think it's, there's been some fantastic positives. Like I've learned a lot about them. I've learned about, you know, what they do at school, and you know, homeschooling, you know, thank goodness is over, but that, you know, sort of had incredible challenges, and the biggest challenge that I think I reported and most people shared was that difficulty with boundaries. For me, it was particularly difficult because as an employment lawyer, we were looking at, you know, our entire workforces, supporting clients whose entire workforces, you know, clubs, hospitality, aged care services were impacted by this, and in, you know, quite a difficult and catastrophic way. And so we needed to be offering, you know, 24-hour support to them at the same time that for the first time ever, I'm grounded at home with 2 kids and a crazy dog that wouldn't stop barking, who, mind you, is loving life at the moment because she's got all her humans at home. But yeah, so it was quite extraordinary. I am looking forward, just to wrap it up, sorry, that's been a long chat, to going back to my usual work from home days, which is, you know, sort of the days that I get to, you know, catch up, and I have my work from home pile. I'm going to go to 2 days instead of the 1, but, you know, without the 300 Zoom chats and the children at home and all the other things, you know, that happen when everybody's working remotely.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Faith, for sharing. And Mark, what are you picking up from looking at these comments? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think the one that jumped out for me, and I absolutely would agree, I won't accept a role that isn't flexible, and I have actually turned down roles because they have not been flexible in the past. And yeah, the thing that steps out for me is the mum guilt comment. So obviously I'm not a mum, but you know, I kind of get it, because I think being serious, you know, being serious and passionate about your role, you know, and also being serious and passionate about parenting, you're always moving from one type of guilt to another. Like there's just some kind of guilt constantly. So you're either feeling guilty because you're not working hard enough, or you're feeling guilty because you're not spending enough time with your kids, or you're feeling guilty because, you know, you're going for a run, and you're hoping that the kids don't wake up while you're on your run because, you know, your wife's doing something. And so you're trying to balance all of these, you know, factors and keep everything fair and performing for everyone. And I think that's very real. And I think we need to be mindful of that from a mental health and wellbeing perspective. And I genuinely try to check in with my staff, and I have in the past with other teams as well, and just let them know that, you know, leaving early is okay. You don't need to, like, you know, you don't need to have flex by stealth. You know, you don't need to pretend that you're not being flexible. Because I know in my experience in other roles, there have been situations where I've arranged flexible arrangements with, you know, the supervisor, and they've gone, but just don't tell anyone because then everyone will want to be flexible. And it's like, well, is that a problem? Like, it's a fascinating experience that we've all been through. But I suppose, you know, my recommendation to people is that, you know, it's well and good to listen, but everyone needs to be prepared to be part of the change. Like if we want things to change, then we all need to be part of. Someone made a comment to me recently. It was like, oh, I'm really interested to see, you know, the how flexible things become in the future after this COVID thing. And I was like, well, we need to be part of that. Like, we can't just sit back and wait for things to get more flexible. Like, you actually have to have the difficult conversations, ask the difficult questions, you know, demonstrate, you know, the benefits, and be part of that conversation. If you sit back, then it's going to take a lot longer.
Yeah, what a great segue to our next question, actually, Mark. So thank you for that. You're reading my mind. So it's over to you. We want to hear from you. What will it take to close the gender flex gap? And so I am going to ask my panel, so whoever would like to answer it. When we talk again in 3 years, I'd love to hear your prediction of how the gender flex gap has changed. And importantly, what do we need to do to get there? So who would like to go first?
I'm happy to start, Lisa here. So if we define the gender flex gap as the difference between, in this case, men and women, and how they access flexibility in order to meet their work and life commitments, it's my hope that the next phase will see more equity in the distribution of flexibility. So men being able to feel confident to ask for flex and to receive it in the same sort of numbers that women do receive it, and so that there's a uniformity around how flexibility is distributed, but that also, on the other half of the flexibility, that what happens outside the workplace is also shared. We don't, you know, we're not hardwired to be fantastic as women at housework. And that's a really boring, unexciting thing that has to be done. So it's my hope that, you know, it's not that in terms of men engaging with more flexible work, it's not just about, and the research shows this, that men tend to do a lot of the high vis childcare stuff, taking kids to birthday parties, dropping them off at school, picking them up, taking them to sport, but they may not be there in the laundry getting grass stains out of football socks. So, you know, there's got to be equity around the distribution of that sort of drudgery as well to help the whole flex gender balance happen. But also has to be said that we actually are in an economy at the moment where a lot of women are in really precarious work. So casualisation of the labour market has a disproportionate impact on women in precarious employment. Women are much more likely to work in casual work, which is really, really problematic, and we've seen it even in the pandemic. They're not able to access, you know, even things like JobKeeper, JobSeeker, because, you know, their casual employment wasn't, you know, for more than 12 months. And so I think we also need to look at how we structure work, and to look more to try and reduce that insecure employment, and to try and ensure that as an economy we take a much more equitable approach. The other thing I hope is that we start to value, Australia has the most gender segregated economy in the OECD, or one of the most, and yet women in Australia are have the highest level of educational attainment in the OECD. So what I hope, so we've got a lot of highly qualified women in employment that's not very well valued, and I hope that the pandemic means that we get more equity in terms of looking at how we value really important work like teaching, nursing, childcare, and that by doing that, we know that when status and pay rises in employment sectors, it attracts more men and boys. We also know that men and boys populating industries and parts of the economy elevates the status of it for everyone in there. And when women populate particular professions, the status, the pay falls. And that's, I mean, if you don't believe me, think of general practitioners. I mean, that used, being a GP used to be a really respected profession when it was all men doing it. And being a teacher or a school principal, you know, nowadays we have, you know, even when I entered the workplace, there were still tea ladies who used to make cups of tea or do lunches for people in offices, and that's now been replaced by baristas. And baristas are much better paid and more qualified and dominated by men. I mean, that's a really, and people are more prepared to pay money for coffee and tea if it's made by a barista than if it was made by a tea lady. So these things are not, you know, they have real impact on real people's lives, and everything that we can do to create equity between men and women around how they access employment, what kind of employment it is, and how they access flexibility, including things like parental leave. You know, let's move away from primary carers and secondary carers. You're a parent or you're not a parent. And if you're a parent, it shouldn't matter. You've got an obligation to care for those children, and trying to level out the idea that there's someone who's more important in the lives of their children, because that is disrespectful to men as much as it is to children. So I think the more we try and approach gender roles and roles in the economy with equity, the more we'll head somewhere towards equal outcomes for both men and women, and that can only benefit relationships, families, employers, and the economy.
Well said. Thank you, Lisa. Got a question here for you, Faye. I think it's probably best directed to you around the legislation. So I'm not sure if you can see the questions, Faye, but I'll read it out. So we also need to deal with the structural impediments government create within legislation, e.g. dad and partner pay. Establishes this very early on as to who's a primary carer. Further to that, the reasons that an employee can legitimately request a flexible work arrangement are in the main about caring responsibilities. So by default, flexible work gets associated to those caring responsibilities. And before I ask you the question, I think what I really want to emphasize today is we have spoken a lot about gender and caring, but the gender flex gap is not just about caring. Men are discriminated against for working flexibly, caring or no caring, in my experience. So the question here, Faye, is what can we do to break down that stigma that is perpetuated in the legislation?
Absolutely. Actually, that was top of my list in terms of how we start to close the gap, was the issue in relation to parental leave, and Lisa touched on it as well. You know, forget this primary carer and secondary carer and dad and partner pay as opposed to, you know, sort of mother pay. The issue there is that, and it was identified actually also by, I saw Annabelle Crabb in her quarterly essay, is that so long as women are, you know, sort of starting off the parenting role and learning how to parent, and it is a foreign land that dads and, you know, don't know about or don't know, you know, how to navigate because they've sort of always been on the outer, then that situation will perpetuate, and then women are more likely to not only take, you know, the parental leave. We know that 70% of caregivers are women. We know that only 42% return to work within 2 years of having a child. We know they're more likely to access flexible arrangements. We know they're more likely to clearly be to also to be in precarious employment, like Lisa said, the part-time work and the casualised roles, which it's a systemic and structural issue that continues to perpetuate. So it does start with some of the legislative changes that are necessary in order to mainstream parental leave and also flexible work arrangements. But if you can't, you know, sort of change the law, then we've got to do it workplace by workplace, or at least gain the influence and advocacy within industries to see that as best practice. The law has changed over the years to go from, for example, flexible work requests could be made for parents of children that were under school age, and now it's, you know, school age children, so all the way through high school. We do have people with disabilities in there. If they're over 55, you can access flexible work, as well as women that are experiencing family violence, or to provide care or support to someone that it is experiencing family violence. So it is a broader net in terms of who can lawfully make a flexible work request under the Fair Work Act now. You know, I wonder whether in 3 years' time we will transition to not needing to have a reason, whether flexible work requests can just be made, and it doesn't have to be, you know, on a specified ground. Certainly, like I said, we've you know, moved to that more than 2 years ago as a firm, and, you know, many were, you know, ahead of us. I'm sure DCA was well ahead of us in that, you know, I think we are increasingly seeing mainstreaming, and this situation now with COVID, I think is going to see more flexible work requests being made, but also I think challenges in terms of whether or not they can be denied on reasonable business grounds, because, you know, whether or not you have the infrastructure or the ability to job share or the ability to work, you know, remotely, is, I think, going to be challenge, or it's going to be challenging to make the argument that there's reasonable business grounds, or that it would pose an unjustifiable hardship to accommodate a flexible work request in circumstances where a business has accommodated it and received, you know, productivity benefits and the benefit of business continuity during a pandemic. To snap back now and say, hey, it's not possible, I think will be challenging. But of course, that can only be challenged by employees who meet the current requirements under the legislation. So someone that doesn't have carers responsibility, someone that wants to, you know, pursue music, or, you know, or yoga, or creative, you know, sort of, you know, creative benefits coming from flexible work, that, you know, sort of mental health is a bit borderline, because that comes into disability. You know, if you have sort of not just a mental health from a well-being point of view, but if you have, you know, a recognised mental health issue, then, you know, that can be part of work request as well. But I do think that, you know, there is a role to play more broadly in the legislation. I think in terms of leadership and companies or organisations can certainly promote flexible working. There should be leadership around the issue, leadership around outcomes rather than presentism, and role models living loudly to get the cultural change as well as the structural change that we need.
They're all fabulous tips. Thank you for sharing those, Faye, and it's such a great reminder. So before we finish up, I'd love to invite you to share your thoughts. So any reflections on this discussion that we've been having, if you jump on Menti, I would love to hear from Mark and Ben on your thoughts. So we've got a statement here of Lisa saying, thank you for sharing, Mark. These types of conversations happen all the time, and it's very important and powerful to call them out. So thank you for sharing your story there, Mark. So we might start with you, Mark, on what are your thoughts on how we can reduce this stigma of men working flexibly, and then over to you, Ben.
Yeah, sure. And just thank you, Vanessa, and thanks everyone for listening. Just being mindful of time, so I'll be as quick as possible. But just touching on a few things that people are saying, and I'll caveat this with the fact that I'm not a researcher or a professor or a doctor, or, you know, and I would genuinely love to do some more research on this to get some evidence and data behind it. But my personal view about how we're going to change, you know, the stigma of men working flexibly is actually outside of the workplace. So like with organizational culture, culture is made up of, you know, not your culture sessions, but your behaviors and your small things that happen every day. So your culture and stigma around society is made up of the behaviors and the attitudes that we have towards men and women and the gender stereotypes that exist around that. So, you know, like I've had times here with, you know, the older generation being present in the house, whereby like I might be in the kitchen making dinner, looking after the kids, and my wife might be outside cleaning the pool, and they'll make some sort of snide comment about how I should be outside cleaning the pool and my wife should be inside, you know, cooking dinner. And I will call it out, and I will have the difficult conversation with those people at that point in time. You know, my conversations about that my daughter, you know, should wear more pink, or my son should wear less pink, you know. So I think those types of conversations help to break down stereotyping of gender roles in society, and then that will lead on to, you know, a breaking down of gender stereotypes in the workplace.
Fabulous, thank you. And I'm conscious for time, so if you need to drop off, please do so. Ben, do you have any final quick remarks?
I would actually reiterate exactly what Mark was saying. It's both outside work and inside work that we need to model behaviour, and we need to call it out, because regardless of what people say at work, I hear exactly the same things outside of work about flexible work. And, you know, it's people not necessarily ridiculing, but just making a comment that, oh, it must be nice, or, you know, something along those lines that suggests that I'm not doing as much of a job as someone else is, who goes into work earlier or who stays longer. And, you know, they don't seem to care that I might do extra hours at night, or that I work the same number of hours they do. That it's the fact that, and these aren't people who work in the public service, these are other friends who work in private sector. And I just can continually tell them, I care more about my family than I do about my job. Career is important, yes, but all it does is give me resources that I can put into my family to make sure that they have a good life. And that's all that matters to me. And they don't often have something to say after that, other than to go, well, I'm going to make more money than you or something. And that's not necessarily true either. But unfortunately, this gender gap that we're talking about, it does come back to that sometimes. So the ability for someone to be in the office from 7 in the morning until 8 at night and to be seen doing it is often beneficial to them, as long as they're producing the outcomes. So what people are saying here about
Oh no, we've lost
calling out
Ben.
the behaviours.
There we go.
So I was just saying the outcomes focus, I think, is going to be very important moving forwards. It's about what you produce, not where and when you produce it.
Absolutely. Thank you very much to our fabulous panel. We've got this amazing feedback. I will leave this open so you can still continue to provide any reflections. So thank you to Lisa, Mark, Faye and Ben. It's been fabulous. We've really, I think, prompted some thoughts, and people are taking this back to their workplace, which is a great thing. If you need some more information, Lisa has some fabulous resources. Diversity Council of Australia, if you Google it, you'll find it. Faye, she provides fabulous legal advice. Mark, great person, willing to connect on LinkedIn. I know he's told me that before. You just need to share where you've met him in the comments. And then Ben. Thank you, Ben. You're not on LinkedIn. No. So thank you very much. And if you need anything else, Diversity Council of Australia, Flexible Working Day website, there's plenty of resources there to help you. So thank you. Have a lovely day. Happy Flexible.
Thanks so much, Vanessa. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.